You already opened it once. You just chose to forget, Naomi said, her voice low but steady, and the words seemed to land before anyone fully understood them as the chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble. The entire ballroom at Harrington Estate holding its breath without knowing why, as William Harrington stood at the center of it all. A man who had built a billion-dollar empire out of precision and control, now frozen for the smallest fraction of a second. That no one else noticed, but Naomi did, because she wasn't looking at his wealth or his guests or the towering ceilings that echoed quiet admiration. She was looking at the safe, the one embedded into the far wall behind him like a monument to something no one dared question, a matte steel surface untouched by time. Or at least that's what everyone believed. Ladies and gentlemen, William began, recovering smoothly, his voice rich and confident, the kind that filled rooms and closed deals. What you're looking at is a piece of history, a custom vault installed over 20 years ago, designed by the best engineers in the country. A ripple of impressed murmurs followed as guests leaned in slightly, their curiosity safely wrapped in luxury. It's never been opened since, he added with a faint smile, as if that fact alone elevated it beyond mere machinery into something almost mythic. Someone laughed softly. Another guest whispered something about priceless contents, but Naomi didn't move, didn't react. She stood just beyond the circle of conversation, her simple dark dress a quiet contrast to the glitter around her, her presence almost invisible until it wasn't, until William's gaze drifted and caught her standing there, still, focused. "And you are?" he asked, not unkindly but not warmly either, the room shifting just enough to acknowledge her existence. Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his, calm, unhurried. "Naomi Carter," she said, nothing more, her name hanging in the air, like a piece of a puzzle no one recognized. William gave a polite nod, already dismissing the moment as he turned back to his audience. "As I was saying, not even top-tier security firms have managed to crack it," he continued. But Naomi stepped forward, just one step, and it was enough to fracture the rhythm. "Let me try," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the room more effectively than volume ever could. A few guests exchanged amused glances. Someone chuckled under their breath. William turned back slowly this time, studying her with a mix of curiosity and quiet disbelief. "You want to try?" he repeated, almost entertained. "Do you have a background in engineering, Miss Carter?" More laughter, gentle but sharp around the edges. Naomi didn't smile, didn't shrink. "No," she answered simply. Then after a beat, "I just think it's not locked the way you believe it is." The laughter faded just a little, not gone, but thinner now. William exhaled through his nose, amused again, gesturing toward the safe with an open palm. "Be my guest," he said, stepping aside as though inviting a harmless spectacle. "One attempt, that's all it will take." The crowd shifted, forming a loose half-circle, drawn in despite themselves as Naomi approached the safe slowly, not like someone eager to prove something, but like someone returning to a place she had already been. The air felt different there, quieter, heavier. She stopped inches away, the cool metal reflecting a faint outline of her face, and for a moment she didn't touch it, didn't even look at the keypad. Instead, her eyes traced the edges, the seams, the small imperfections no one else would notice. William crossed his arms, watching now, something tightening beneath his calm exterior. "You're wasting your one chance," he said lightly. But there was an edge to it now. Naomi finally lifted her hand, not to the keypad, not to the handle, but to the surface itself, her palm hovering just before making contact as if she were feeling something beneath it, something not visible. And then she spoke again, quieter this time, not for the room, only for him. "You installed it in October," she said, "right after the storm." William's expression didn't change immediately, but something behind his eyes did, something small and dangerous. "That's public record," he replied quickly. Too quickly. Naomi's hand pressed gently against the steel now, steady, unshaken. "No," she said, almost kindly. "The date isn't what matters." A pause stretched between them, thin and sharp. "It's why you closed it." And just like that, the room, the music, the quiet laughter all seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of William's breath as it slowed, then caught. And for the first time since the night began, The man who controlled everything had no immediate answer. William Harrington did not answer immediately, and that silence was louder than anything that had been said all evening as the guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the billionaire and the woman who stood in front of his untouched safe, like she had just asked a question no one else knew existed. "I think that is enough," William said finally, his voice controlled but thinner now, less effortless than before. "You have made your point, Miss Carter." A few people nodded quickly as if eager to restore the balance of the room. Someone even let out a polite laugh that faded too fast. But Naomi did not move her hand from the surface of the steel, her fingers resting there as though the metal itself was telling her something. "I have not made a point yet," she said quietly, and the calm in her voice unsettled more than any challenge would have. William stepped closer now, close enough that the distance between them felt deliberate, measured. "You are starting to cross a line," he replied, still composed, still careful. But there was something else underneath it now, something protective, something guarded. Naomi turned her head slightly, not away from the safe, but just enough to acknowledge him. "No," she said. "I am standing exactly where you left it." The words landed softly, but they carried weight, the kind that did not need volume to be felt. A murmur rippled through the room again, quieter this time, more uncertain. William's jaw tightened for just a second before. Something said many times before to avoid something deeper. Naomi watched him, really watched him. Not the man he presented, but the pauses between his words. "You did not seal it for protection," she said, her voice steady. "You sealed it because you could not look at what was inside anymore." The room fell still again. No one laughing now, no one whispering. Even the faint clink of glasses had stopped, as if the space itself was listening. William's eyes flicked to the safe, then back to her. Just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Naomi saw it. "You should stop," he said, lower now. Not loud, not commanding, but urgent in a way he had not been before. Naomi slowly withdrew her hand from the steel and let it fall to her side. Not in surrender, not in retreat, but in preparation. "Do you remember the code?" she asked, and this time she looked directly at him. The question simple on the surface, but carrying something much heavier beneath it. William let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh, but did not reach his eyes. "Of course I remember the code," he replied quickly. "I chose not to use it." Naomi nodded slightly, as if confirming something only she understood. "No," she said softly. "You remember the numbers, but you do not remember why they matter." William's composure flickered again, his hands shifting just slightly at his sides, subtle enough that most would miss it. "But not her, never her." "This is ridiculous," he said, more firmly now, turning toward the safe as if to end the moment himself. "There is nothing in there worth this kind of performance." But even as he spoke, he did not touch it, did not reach for the keypad, his body stopping just short, as though an invisible line had been drawn years ago, and he had never stepped across it since. Naomi took a single step closer, closing the distance he would not, her voice dropping just enough that only he could hear the next words clearly. "You closed it the night she stopped answering," she said, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. William's breath caught again, deeper this time, his gaze locking onto hers with something raw breaking through the surface, something he had spent years keeping buried behind control and success and silence. The guests did not understand what had changed, but they felt it. The air heavier, the moment sharper, like the room itself had shifted into something real. Naomi did not look away. "You think it stayed locked because no one could open it," she continued quietly. "But it stayed locked because you never allowed yourself to try again." William swallowed. The smallest motion, but it carried more weight than any speech he had given that night, his eyes drifting once more to the safe, then back to Naomi. And for the first time there was no dismissal in his expression, no control, only the beginning of recognition, and that was far more dangerous than anything else. William Harrington did not realize he had taken a step back until the heel of his shoe met the edge of the marble inlay behind him, and the faint shift in balance forced him to stop, his eyes still locked on Naomi, as if moving any further might confirm something he was not ready to face. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the polite silence of wealth and observation. It was something else now, something tighter, something that pressed against the ribs. "You are making assumptions about Things you do not understand, he said finally, his voice quieter than before, but carrying an edge that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with restraint. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just certain. Then help me understand, she replied, her tone even, the kind that did not provoke but did not retreat either. William let out a breath through his nose, his gaze drifting for a brief moment toward the guests who now watched with a focus that, her reflection merging with the cold steel. It concerns you, she said softly. And that is enough. William's jaw tightened again, and this time he did not hide it. You think you know something because you are standing here making statements, he replied, his voice gaining a little strength again as if rebuilding a wall. But you are guessing. Naomi shook her head once slow, deliberate. No, she said. I am remembering. That word did not echo in the room, but it should have because it changed something in the air immediately. William's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, something deeper than irritation, something closer to disbelief. That is not possible, he said, almost under his breath. Naomi did not look away. You told yourself that for a long time, she answered. That no one would ever come back to this moment, that no one would ever stand here and ask you to open it again. William's hand moved before he realized it had his fingers brushing against the edge of the safe, not gripping, not opening, just touching, like someone confirming that something was still there, still real. Naomi watched that movement carefully, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something in her expression, not triumph, not satisfaction, but recognition. You do not have to protect it anymore, she said gently, the shift in her tone subtle, but unmistakable. William looked at his hand, then pulled it back quickly as if the contact had been a mistake. I am not protecting anything, he replied sharply, but the denial came too fast, too reflexive. Naomi's eyes softened just slightly, but her voice remained steady. Then open it, she said. And that was it, no explanation, no challenge, no performance, just a simple request that carried more weight than anything else that had been said. The room held its breath again, but this time it felt different, not expectant, not entertained, but waiting. William stared at the safe, then at the keypad, then back at Naomi, his chest rising and falling slower, now more deliberate. You think this is a game, he said after a long pause. You think this is about proving something in front of an audience? Naomi shook her head again. No, she said quietly. I think this is the first time you have stood this close to it in years. William did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched longer than any of the others before it. His eyes fixed on the keypad, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something easier, something distant, something safe. But they did not change. They stayed exactly as they were, exactly as they had been the night he walked away. Naomi's voice came again, softer now, almost like a memory. You did not forget the code, she said. You stopped trusting what would happen if you used it. William swallowed slowly, his throat tightening, as something inside him shifted, not breaking, not collapsing, but moving after being still for far too long. His hand lifted again, this time, not hovering, not hesitating, but moving toward the keypad. The faint glow of the numbers reflecting in his eyes as the room around him disappeared piece by piece, until there was only the safe, only the code, only the moment he had avoided for years. His fingers hovered just above the first number, and for a second they trembled, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for him to feel it. Enough to know that this was no longer about a locked door. Naomi did not speak again. She did not move. She simply stood there, present, steady, waiting. And for the first time, William did not look away from the past he had sealed behind steel as his hand slowly began to lower toward the keypad. William's finger hovered a fraction of an inch above the keypad, suspended in a moment that felt stretched beyond time itself as the faint glow of the numbers reflected in his eyes. And for the first time in years, he did not see a lock. He saw a choice, and that realization alone made his chest tighten, as if something long buried had just taken a breath. You do not have to do this, he said suddenly, his voice quieter now, almost careful, not looking at Naomi, but not fully looking at the keypad either, as if speaking to both and neither at the same time. Naomi did not move, her presence steady beside him like a constant he could not dismiss. You already know that is not true, she replied softly. And her words did not push him forward, but they removed the last place he could step back to. The room behind them remained frozen, no one daring to interrupt, no one even pretending this was still entertainment, because something deeper had taken over, something that made even the most distant observer feel like they were standing too close to something private. William inhaled slowly, deliberately, and then his finger pressed the first number. A soft electronic tone broke the silence, and it echoed louder than it should have, sharper than expected, and immediately his body reacted, his shoulders tightening as if the sound alone had confirmed something he had tried to avoid for decades. His hand paused. Hovering again, that is one, Naomi said quietly, not counting, not urging, just acknowledging, and that somehow made it harder, not easier. William let out a breath that trembled just slightly before he pressed the second number. Another tone, another echo, and with it came something else, not a memory in full but fragments of one. A night filled with unfinished words, a door that closed too quickly, a silence that followed longer than it should have. His jaw tightened. You are doing this on purpose, he muttered under his breath. Though it was unclear whether he meant her or himself, Naomi's gaze never left him. No, she answered. You are. The third number came slower, his finger hesitating just long enough to reveal the weight behind it. The tone that followed softer now, or maybe it only felt that way because the room had gone so still that even sound seemed to move carefully. William swallowed again, his throat dry as the keypad waited for the final input. The last piece of something he had refused to complete for years. You think opening it changes anything? He said, his voice barely above a whisper now. Stripped of performance, stripped of control, Naomi's answer came just as quietly. I think leaving it closed already did. And that was it. No argument, no pressure, just truth placed gently where it could not be ignored. William closed his eyes for a brief moment, not long enough to escape, but long enough to feel the weight of everything he had avoided pressing against him. All at once. Then he opened them again and pressed the final number. The tone that followed lingered just a fraction longer, and then there was silence. A deep, heavy silence that seemed to pull the entire room inward. Nothing happened at first, and for a single heartbeat, it looked as though the safe would remain exactly as it had always been. Unmoved, untouched, unchanged. But then a soft mechanical shift broke through, subtle but undeniable. The internal lock releasing with a muted click that carried more finality than any loud noise could. William's hand dropped slightly as if the action had drained something from him. His eyes fixed on the seam of the door as it separated just enough to be seen. Not open, not yet, but no longer sealed. Naomi did not reach for it. She did not rush the moment. She simply stood there, allowing the truth of it to exist fully before anything else happened. William stared at the small gap, his breath uneven now as realization settled in, not like a sudden shock, but like something inevitable finally arriving. It was never about the mechanism, Naomi said softly, her voice steady but not cold. It was about the moment you stopped. William's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but no words came, because there was nothing left to deny. The safe had opened not because it could be forced, not because it could be solved, but because he had finally allowed himself to return to the exact point where he had walked away, and now there was only one thing left between him and everything he had tried to keep buried, the door itself, waiting quietly to be opened. The safe door remained slightly open, just enough to reveal darkness inside, not empty, but not yet seen. And that narrow gap felt heavier than if it had swung wide all at once, as William Harrington stood there unmoving, his eyes fixed on the thin line, where steel had separated for the first time in decades. His breathing slower now, but uneven, as if each inhale carried more weight than the last. The room behind him stayed completely silent, no one daring to step closer, no one willing to interrupt. What no longer felt like a demonstration, but something far more personal. Naomi did not move either, her presence steady beside him, not pushing, not pulling, simply there as if this moment had always been waiting for her. It is open, she said softly, not as a declaration, but as a truth that needed to be acknowledged. William swallowed, his throat tight, as his hand lifted again, this time not toward the keypad, but toward the edge of the door, his fingers stopping just before touching it. The hesitation small, but unmistakable. You think whatever is in there matters now, he said quietly, his voice stripped of the confidence that once filled the room. Naomi's gaze remained on the safe, not on him. It mattered enough for you to close it, she replied. So yes, it still matters. Her words did not rush him, they did not demand anything. but they removed the last excuse to turn away. William's fingers finally made contact with the cold steel, and for a brief second he flinched, not from the temperature, but from the familiarity of it. This was not new, this was not unknown, this was something he had chosen to leave behind, and now it was here again, unchanged, waiting. He exhaled slowly and pulled the door open just a few more inches, the hinges moving with a quiet resistance, as if even they had not expected to move again. The interior remained dim at first, the angle of the light not yet reaching fully inside, and for a moment nothing was clear, just shapes, shadows, the suggestion of objects rather than their truth. William leaned slightly closer, his eyes adjusting, his posture shifting from distance to presence. Naomi stepped just enough to the side, allowing him the space to face it directly, not stepping and not interfering. The light finally caught the inside, and the contents revealed themselves, not stacks of money, not documents of power, not anything that matched the image the guests had imagined. Instead, there was a small collection carefully placed, untouched by time. A photograph resting against the back wall, its edges slightly worn, a folded letter beneath it, sealed but never opened again, and beside them a simple silver bracelet, the kind that held meaning, not value. William's breath caught again, deeper this time, as recognition did not arrive slowly, it arrived all at once, his hand tightening slightly against the door as his eyes locked onto the photograph. He did not reach for it, not yet, but he could not look away. The room behind him did not react immediately because they did not understand what they were seeing, but they felt the shift, the weight of something real replacing the illusion of mystery. Naomi's voice came again, quieter, now almost like a memory surfacing. "You did not lock away wealth," she said. "You locked away a moment you could not face again." William's jaw trembled just slightly, his composure no longer something he could hold together with ease. "You do not know what you are talking about," he said, but the words lacked strength, lacked conviction. Naomi did not argue, she did not push, she simply took one slow step closer, her eyes moving from the photograph to the bracelet, then back to him. "You never came back for it," she said. "Not once." William closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, as if forcing himself to stay present. "Some things are better left where they are," he replied, his voice low, strained. Naomi shook her head gently. "No," she said. "Some things only stay buried because we refuse to look at them." The silence that followed was no longer tense, it was heavy, grounded, real. William finally released his grip on the door and slowly reached inside, his fingers hovering over the photograph, but stopping just before touching it, as if the final step required something more than movement, something more than courage. And Naomi watched him, not with expectation, but with understanding, because she knew this was not about opening a safe anymore. It was about whether he was ready to face what he had kept inside it all along. William's hand hovered inches above the photograph, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that does not arrive gently, but settles all at once like a truth that has been waiting too long to be seen. The room behind him remained silent, yet no longer distant. The weight of what sat inside the safe now pressing outward into every corner of the space, as if the past itself had been given permission to exist again. Naomi stood just behind his shoulder, not intruding, not guiding, simply present, her eyes steady on the moment he had avoided for years. "You do not have to rush it," she said softly, and her voice did not break the silence, it shaped it, giving it direction. William exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling as he finally reached forward and lifted the photograph from its place inside the safe. The movement careful, deliberate, as if the object carried more than paper and ink. The light caught the image as he brought it closer, and for a moment he did not look at it directly, he only held it there, suspended between memory and reality. Then his eyes lowered, and everything shifted. His expression changed, not dramatically, not suddenly, but in layers, the control he had worn all evening slipping piece by piece as recognition deepened. The photograph showed a younger version of himself standing beside a woman whose smile was warm, unguarded, real in a way that did not exist in the room around him now. And beside them a small moment. Captured, not posed, not arranged, but lived. Something simple, something honest, something that had not been meant to disappear. William's breath caught again, softer this time, almost unsteady, as his thumb brushed lightly against the edge of the image. "It was supposed to be temporary," he said under his breath, not to Naomi, not to the room, but to himself. Naomi heard him anyway. "Nothing that matters is ever temporary." She replied quietly. William closed his eyes briefly, as if the words had landed somewhere deeper than he expected. When he opened them again, his gaze dropped to the folded letter beneath where the photograph had rested, its edges still sealed, untouched by time. He hesitated only a second before reaching for it, the paper slightly stiff as he lifted it free, his fingers tracing the crease where it had never been opened again. "You never read it," Naomi said, not accusing, not surprised, simply stating what already was. William shook his head faintly, the motion small but heavy. "I could not," he admitted, his voice lower now, stripped of everything except truth. The room behind them shifted subtly as a few guests leaned closer, not out of curiosity, but because they could feel the moment deepening into something they did not fully understand but could not ignore. Naomi stepped just slightly to his side, her gaze on the letter, then back to him. "You thought leaving it closed would keep everything the same," she said. But all it did was leave the question unanswered. William stared at the letter for a long moment, his grip tightening just enough to show the conflict within him. Then slowly, carefully, he broke the seal, the soft sound of paper separating echoing far louder than it should have in the stillness. He unfolded it piece by piece, the movement deliberate, as if each fold carried a memory he had not allowed himself to revisit. His eyes moved across the page, and whatever he read did not show immediately on his face, not in a dramatic shift, not in visible reaction, but in something quieter, something internal. His shoulders lowered slightly, the tension easing, not because the truth was easier, but because it was finally present. Naomi watched him, not for his reaction, but for the moment he allowed himself to feel it fully. "You did not lose this," she said gently. "You paused it." William's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but no words came at first. Instead, he looked back down at the photograph, then at the bracelet still resting inside the safe, untouched, waiting. His hand lowered slowly, the letter still open in his grasp, as something inside him began to change, not all at once, not completely, but enough to shift the weight he had carried for years. The room no longer felt like a stage, it felt like a witness. And in that quiet space between what had been hidden and what was now seen, William Harrington finally understood that opening the safe had not revealed the past. It had returned him to it, and for the first time he did not step away. William's eyes remained fixed on the letter, his gaze moving slowly across each line, as if time itself had slowed to match the weight of every word. And whatever he was reading no longer belonged to the past alone. It was unfolding again in real time, reshaping the man standing in front of the open safe. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper, not crumpling it, not damaging it, but holding it with a kind of care that had been absent for years. Naomi stood beside him, quiet but unwavering, her presence no longer an interruption, but something else entirely, something that had guided him back to this exact point. She did not stop reaching. Naomi said gently, her voice low enough that it did not disturb the room, but clear enough that it reached him fully. William did not respond immediately, but his jaw shifted, the muscles tightening, as if resisting something rising within him. He lowered the letter just enough to glance at the photograph again, then back to the words in his hand. "I thought time would make it easier," he said finally, his voice no longer controlled, no longer shaped for an audience, but raw and uneven. Naomi nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving him. "Time does not erase what was never faced," she replied, the truth in her words settling into the space between them. The guests behind them remained silent, not out of politeness now, but because they could feel that this was no longer something meant for display. This was something real, something personal, unfolding in front of them without permission. William let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering further, as if something inside him had finally begun to release. His eyes moved again across the letter, lingering on certain lines as if they held more than the others. "She waited," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She believed I would come back." The words were not dramatic, but they carried a depth that filled the room in a way no speech ever had. Naomi stepped slightly closer, not to invade, but to be heard without distance. "And you believed staying away would protect you," she said. But it only left her waiting alone. William closed his eyes for a brief moment, the truth of that settling deeper than anything else had so far. When he opened them again, they were different, not in appearance, but in clarity. Like something that had been avoided was finally being seen without distortion. His gaze shifted downward toward the bracelet still resting inside the safe, untouched by his hands until now. Slowly, carefully, He reached for it, lifting it from its place, the metal catching the light faintly as it moved. His thumb brushed across its surface, the gesture instinctive, familiar, as if his hands remembered something his mind had tried to forget. "She gave me this," he said softly, his voice steadier now, but heavier with meaning. Naomi watched him closely, her expression calm but attentive. "And you put it away," she replied, not accusing, not condemning, simply connecting the moment to what had been done. William nodded faintly, his grip on the bracelet tightening just slightly. "I thought if I removed everything that reminded me of that night, I could move forward," he admitted. Naomi's response came gently but firmly. "You did not move forward," she said. "You built everything around the place you refused to return to." The truth of it did not hit him all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, as he stood there holding the photograph, the letter, and the bracelet, the three things that had remained exactly where he left them, while everything else in his life had changed. The room behind him no longer mattered. The guests no longer existed in his awareness. There was only this moment, this space, this choice that had been waiting for him longer than he wanted to admit. "Why now?" he asked, suddenly, his voice quiet, but searching, as he turned to look at Naomi fully for the first time since the safe had opened. "Why are you here?" Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, without fear. "Because you were finally ready to see it," she said. "And because some things are not meant to stay buried forever." William studied her face, as if trying to understand something beyond her words, something deeper, something that connected her to all of this in a way that had not yet been spoken. The question lingered between them, unanswered but not ignored. And as he looked back down at the objects in his hands, he realized that opening the safe had not ended anything. It had only begun something he could no longer walk away from. William did not look away from Naomi this time, and that alone shifted something deeper than anything that had happened before, because for the first time he was no longer looking past her or through her. He was looking at her, as if she carried a piece of something he had not yet fully understood. The bracelet still resting in his hand, the letter slightly lowered but not released. "You speak like you were there," he said quietly, his voice steady now, but searching. Naomi did not answer immediately, and that silence was not hesitation, it was timing, the kind that allows truth to arrive without force. "I was not there," she said finally, her tone calm but layered. "But I know what it leaves behind." William's brow tightened slightly, not in rejection, but in thought, as if her words connected to something just out of reach. The room behind them remained still, the guests no longer shifting, no longer reacting, because whatever this moment had become, it no longer belonged to them. William glanced back down at the photograph again, his thumb brushing lightly across the edge where time had worn it just enough to remind him that it had not been touched in years. "She wrote that she waited," he said slowly, as if testing the weight of the sentence. "That she came back here more than once." His voice dropped slightly at the end, not from weakness, but from realization. Naomi nodded gently. "She believed you would open it again," she said. "Not the safe, you." The distinction settled into the space between them, heavier than anything else. William inhaled slowly, his chest rising deeper than before as the meaning began to take shape. His gaze drifting not to the safe, but to the room around him, the walls, the space, the life he had built around something unresolved. "I thought closing it would give me control," he admitted. "I thought I could decide what mattered by what I kept and what I removed." Naomi stepped slightly closer now, her voice still soft, but carrying more presence. "You did decide," she said. "You just chose to leave something unfinished." William's jaw tightened again, not in defense, but in acceptance, the kind that does not argue because it already knows. His eyes returned to her, and for a moment there was no barrier, no distance, just two people standing on opposite sides of a truth that no longer needed to be hidden. "You still have not told me how you know any of this," he said. Not demanding, not accusing, just asking. Naomi held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, something deeper, something more personal. "Because I have read words like that before," she replied. "Words that were never answered." William's breath slowed, as if the connection was forming piece by piece, not complete, but undeniable. His fingers tightened slightly around the bracelet again, his thumb tracing the small, engraved detail on its surface, as if his hands remembered something his mind was only now allowing back in. "She said she would come back one last time," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I did not show up, Naomi's eyes softened just slightly, but her tone remained steady. Then that was her answer. She finished quietly, the sentence settling fully between them. William closed his eyes for a brief second, and when he opened them again, something had changed, not in appearance, but in direction, as if for the first time in years, he was no longer looking backward, trying to undo something, but forward, trying to understand it. His gaze moved again to the open safe, then back to Naomi. "And what happens now?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying everything that had led to this moment. Naomi did not hesitate. "Now you decide whether this stays a memory or becomes something you finally face," she said, and the clarity of her words left no room for avoidance, no space to step away. The room behind them felt distant now, almost unreal compared to the weight of what stood between them. William looked down at the photograph, the letter, and the bracelet once more, the three pieces of a moment he had tried to lock away, and as he held them, there was a shift, not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable, a movement away from distance toward responsibility. And for the first time since the safe had opened, he did not feel like he was standing in front of something he needed to escape. He felt like he was standing at the beginning of something he could no longer ignore. William stood still for a long moment, the photograph in one hand, the letter slightly folded in the other, and the bracelet resting against his palm like something that had waited far too long to be held again, his eyes no longer drifting but fixed, grounded, as if the pieces in his hands were no longer fragments of the past, but anchors pulling him into something real, something present. The room around him remained silent, but it felt distant now, like a world that had stepped back to allow something more important to unfold. Naomi did not speak immediately. She watched him with the same steady calm she had carried from the beginning, not pushing him forward, not filling the space, just allowing the weight of the moment to exist fully. "She came back more than once," William said again, this time not as a question, not even as a realization, but as a fact that had finally settled into place. Naomi nodded once. "Yes," she said quietly, "and each time she left without knowing if you ever would." William's grip tightened slightly around the letter, his eyes lowering again to the words that had waited years to be read. "I thought I had time," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of any distance. "I thought there would be another chance to explain, to fix it, to show up the right way." Naomi stepped just a fraction closer, her voice still gentle, but carrying more weight now. "Time does not wait for certainty," she replied. "It moves with or without it." William exhaled slowly, the truth of that settling deeper than anything else had so far, his shoulders lowering further, as if something he had carried for years had begun to loosen its hold. His gaze moved once more to the bracelet, and this time he did not just look at it, he held it firmly, his fingers closing around it, as if choosing not to let it go again. "I built everything after that night," he said. "Every decision, every move, every success, it all came after I walked away from this." Naomi's eyes followed the slight motion of his hand as he gestured toward the safe. "And none of it replaced what you left behind," she said, not dismissing what he had built, but placing it in its true context. William shook his head faintly, not in disagreement, but in recognition. "No," he admitted. "It just filled the space around it." The words lingered in the air, heavier than any statement of wealth or power ever could. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "You cannot change that moment," she said, "but you can decide what it means now." William looked at her, then really looked at her, as if searching for something beyond the words, something deeper that had been present from the very beginning, but not yet named. "You keep speaking like you know what it is to stand on the other side of that door," he said quietly. Naomi did not look away, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes shifted again, not revealing everything but allowing something closer to the surface. "I know what it feels like to wait for someone who never comes back," she answered. And this time there was no distance in her voice, no separation between observation and experience. William's breath caught slightly at that, not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed something he had been sensing without understanding. His eyes studied her more carefully, now not just seeing her presence, but trying to understand her place in all of this. "And you think opening this changes that?" he asked. Naomi shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "Opening this does not change what happened." She paused just long enough for the next words to land fully. "But it changes what you do with it." The clarity of that statement settled into the room with a quiet finality. William looked back down at the photograph, the letter, and the bracelet once more, and for the first time, he did not see them as something to be hidden or avoided. He saw them as something unfinished, something that still held a direction forward, even if he did not yet know what it looked like. His grip on them steadied, his posture shifting not in strength, but in intention. The safe behind him remained open, not as a symbol of something broken, but as something revealed. And in that moment, William Harrington understood that the question was no longer why he had closed it. The question was what he was going to do now that it was finally open. William did not move right away, and that stillness was no longer hesitation, it was consideration, the kind that only comes after something has been fully seen, fully acknowledged. His grip on the photograph, the letter, and the bracelet steady. Now, not because the weight had lessened, but because he had stopped resisting it. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer tense or uncertain. It had become something almost respectful, as if everyone present understood without words that they were witnessing a moment that did not belong to them. Naomi remained beside him, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded. "You said she came back," William said slowly, his voice no longer searching, but following a line of thought. He had finally allowed himself to walk. Naomi nodded once. "Yes," she replied. More than once. William's gaze dropped again to the letter, his thumb brushing the edge of the page where the fold had been sealed for years. Then she stopped, he said. And this time it was not a question. Naomi did not answer immediately because she did not need to. The truth was already there in the space between them. "People do not wait forever," she said quietly. "Even when they want to." William closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was something clearer there, something more defined. Not regret alone, but understanding. His posture shifted slightly as he turned away from the safe, not to escape it, but to face something beyond it. His eyes scanning the room, not seeing the guests, not seeing the luxury, but seeing the distance between what he had built and what he had left behind. "I convinced myself that silence was safer," he admitted, his voice steady now, but heavy with truth, "that if I did not open it, I would not have to face what I had chosen." Naomi's gaze followed him as he stepped forward, just one step away from the safe, the object still in his hands. "And now you know that silence does not protect anything," she said. William gave a faint nod, not in agreement, but in recognition. "No," he replied. "It just delays the cost." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, the kind that does not need to be emphasized because it already carries its own weight. Naomi took a small step forward, aligning herself with him rather than behind him, no longer guiding him toward the safe, but standing beside him as he faced what came next. "So what do you do now?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as an opening. William looked down at the photograph again, his eyes lingering on the moment captured there. "Something simple, something real. I find out where she went," he said quietly, the words forming not from impulse but from decision. Naomi's expression did not change dramatically, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, something that reflected both understanding and something deeper. "And if she is no longer waiting?" she asked gently. William inhaled slowly, his chest rising as he considered the question fully, not avoiding it, not softening it. "Then I will not ask her to," he said, his voice steady now, carrying a kind of clarity that had not been present before. "But I will not pretend it did not matter." Naomi nodded, once her gaze steady on him. "That is the first honest thing you have said tonight," she replied softly. William let out a breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, not from humor, but from release, his shoulders easing slightly as if the decision itself had shifted something inside him. He turned his head slightly, looking back at the open safe, the door still wide enough to show what had been hidden for so long. "I built an entire life trying to move past this," he said, "and all it did was bring me back here." Naomi followed his gaze to the safe, then back to him. "Not back," she corrected gently. "Forward." The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. William stood there for a moment longer, then slowly, carefully, he placed the photograph, the letter, and the bracelet together in his hands, not returning them to the safe, not leaving them behind, but holding them as if they finally belonged in the present rather than the past. The room remained quiet, no one speaking, no one moving, as if everyone understood that whatever came next would not happen here, not in this space, not in this moment. William Harrington took a final look at the open safe, then turned away from it, completely not closing the door, not sealing it again, but leaving it exactly as it was, open. And for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to hide what it contained because the truth was no longer inside it. It was now in what he chose to do next. William did not look back at the safe again as he stepped forward. The weight in his hands no longer something hidden, but something carried. And that shift was visible not in grand movement, but in the quiet certainty of his posture, the kind that no longer needed to perform or prove anything. The guests parted slightly without being asked, not out of deference to wealth, but because they could sense something had changed in him that made the distance necessary. Naomi walked beside him, not leading, not following, but matching his pace exactly. Her presence no longer a disruption, but something that had become part of the direction he had chosen. "You are leaving it open," she said quietly, not questioning but acknowledging what he had done. William nodded once without slowing his steps. "It does not need to be closed anymore," he replied, his voice steady. And for the first time there was no hesitation in it. No second layer of doubt behind the words. Just truth. They moved toward the edge of the room where the noise of the evening had faded into something distant, something almost irrelevant. The lights still warm, the music still playing softly somewhere behind them, but none of it touched the space they were in now. "You understand that this does not fix anything," Naomi said after a moment, her tone calm but grounded. William stopped, then not abruptly, but deliberately, turning slightly to face her fully. The photograph, the letter, and the bracelet still held carefully in his hands. "I am not trying to fix it," he said. "I am trying to face it." The distinction settled between them with a quiet clarity that did not need to be explained further. Naomi studied him for a moment longer, her eyes searching not for doubt, but for truth, and whatever she saw there held. "That is not something most people choose to do," she said. William gave a faint nod. "I did not choose it for a long time," he admitted. "I chose everything else instead." Naomi's gaze softened just slightly. At that, not with sympathy, but with understanding. "And now?" she asked gently. William looked down at the objects in his hands again, the photograph catching the light just enough to reveal the moment frozen in it. "Now I stopped choosing everything else first," he said. And there was no hesitation in that statement, no uncertainty left to hide behind. Naomi let the silence settle for a second before speaking again. "Do you know where to start?" she asked. William shook his head, once honest without defense. "No," he replied. "But I know I cannot stand still anymore." The simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any plan could have. Naomi nodded slowly. "That is enough," she said. And for a moment neither of them moved, the space between past and future hanging quietly in the air. William glanced briefly toward the doorway beyond the room, the world outside waiting not as an escape, but as the next step. "You knew this would happen," he said suddenly, his voice not accusing but curious as he turned back to her. Naomi held his gaze steady. "I knew you would reach a point where you could not avoid it anymore," she replied. "What you did after that was always your choice." William considered that for a moment, then nodded faintly as if confirming something internally. "And you," he said, "you have done this before." Naomi's expression did not change, but her eyes held something deeper now, something that had always been there just beneath the surface. "I have stood where someone else chose not to come back," she said quietly. "So I know what it costs when they do not." The words settled between them, not heavy but real. William looked at her for a moment longer, as if understanding her, not fully but enough. "Then you also know what it means when they finally do," he said. Naomi did not answer immediately, but there was the faintest shift in her expression, something that reflected both recognition and something unresolved. "Yes," she said softly, "I do." William exhaled slowly, then turned again toward the doorway, his grip on the photograph, the letter, and the bracelet steady, not tightening, not loosening, just holding the room behind them. Still silent, still watching, but no longer part of what came next. And as he took his first step forward out of the space that had held him for years, it was clear that the moment inside the safe had ended, but the story it contained had only just begun to unfold beyond it. The night air outside the Harrington estate felt different the moment William stepped through the doors. Cooler, sharper, as if the world beyond the walls had been waiting for him to return, without the layers he had built around himself. The sound of the city in the distance, faint but steady, a reminder that life had continued moving forward even while he had remained anchored to a moment he refused to face. Naomi stepped out beside him, her pace matching his without effort, neither of them speaking immediately as the quiet stretched between them, not empty, but full of everything that had already been said. William paused near the edge of the stone steps, his gaze drifting outward, not searching for anything specific, but adjusting to a world that no longer felt like something he could control. The photograph, the letter, and the bracelet still in his hands, no longer hidden, no longer distant. "I do not know where she went," he said finally, his voice low but clear. Naomi nodded slightly, her eyes on him, not questioning, not judging. "Then you start with where she last believed you would be," she replied. William let that settle his mind, tracing the memory, now not avoiding it, not reshaping it, but allowing it to exist as it was. "She said she would come back one last time," he repeated. "If I did not show up, that would be her answer." Naomi's gaze softened just slightly. "Then that place still matters," she said, "even if she is no longer there." William exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing as if the direction did not solve anything, but gave him something real to follow. "I spent years building systems, plans, strategies," he said, almost to himself, "and none of them prepared me for something this simple." Naomi's expression held a quiet understanding. "The hardest things usually are," she said. William glanced down at the bracelet again, his fingers tightening slightly around it. "I thought I had lost the chance to make this right," he admitted. Naomi shook her head gently. "You did lose the chance to make it the way it was," she said. "But you did not lose the chance to show up differently." The distinction settled into him deeper than anything else had so far. William lifted his gaze again, looking out into the distance, not as a man searching for control, but as someone accepting uncertainty for the first time in a long time. "And if she does not want to see me?" he asked quietly. Naomi did not hesitate. "Then you respect that," she answered. "But at least you will no longer be the one who never came back." William absorbed that in silence, his grip on the photograph, steady, now not trembling, not hesitant, just present. The faint sound of the wind moving through the trees carried across the open space, grounding the moment in something real, something outside of memory and regret. "You knew I would come out here," he said after a moment, his voice calmer, now more certain. Naomi gave a small nod. "I knew you would not stay in that room," she replied. "Not after you chose to open it." William let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a laugh, not from humor, but from recognition. "You have a way of seeing what people avoid," he said. Naomi's gaze shifted slightly toward the distance before returning to him. "I see what happens when they do not face it," she said. "That is enough." William studied her for a moment longer, the same question lingering beneath the surface, not fully asked but not gone. "And you," he said slowly, "have you ever gone back?" Naomi's expression did not change immediately, but there was a pause, a small one but real. "Not yet," she said quietly. William nodded once, not pressing, not asking more, because he understood that some answers arrive in their own time. The two of them stood there for a moment longer, the space between them no longer defined by tension or distance, but by something quieter, something shared. Then William straightened slightly, not in posture, but in purpose, his gaze moving forward again. "Then I guess we both know what comes next," he said. Naomi met his eyes, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. "Yes," she replied. "You go back." And with that, the direction was no longer abstract. It was clear, not easy, not certain, but real. And as William Harrington took his first step down the stone path, away from everything he had built and towards something he had left behind for far too long, he did not look back. Because for the first time, the past was no longer something he was running from. It was something he was finally ready to face. The road back did not look the same as it had in his memory, and that was the first thing William noticed as the car slowed near the edge of a quiet street miles away from the estate. The city lights no longer towering or distant, but replaced by older buildings, softer shadows, and the kind of stillness that carried stories instead of silence. He stepped out slowly, the gravel beneath his shoes shifting slightly, as if even the ground acknowledged that this moment had weight. Naomi stood beside him. Again, not ahead, not behind, just present as she had been from the beginning. The photograph, the letter, and the bracelet still in his hands, now no longer artifacts, but something closer to a compass. "This is where she said she would come back," William said quietly, his eyes scanning the familiar outlines now touched by time, but not erased. Naomi nodded, once her gaze steady. "Then this is where you begin," she replied. The air was cooler here, the kind that settled into the skin and made everything feel more real, more immediate. William took a few steps forward, each one measured not from hesitation, but from awareness. The building in front of him stood unchanged in structure, but altered in feeling, no longer a place he had left behind, but a place that had been waiting, without promise, without certainty. He stopped near the entrance, his breath steady, but deeper now, as if preparing for something that could not be controlled or predicted. I thought coming back would feel like reopening. Something broken, he said. Naomi's voice followed gently. It feels like that because you never closed it properly. William nodded faintly, the truth of that no longer something he resisted. His eyes moved to the door, then back to the objects in his hands. The photograph catching a faint reflection of the streetlight, the bracelet resting quietly against his palm, the letter folded again, but no longer sealed. And if she is not here, he said. Naomi did not hesitate. Then you still showed up. She answered. And that matters. William let out a slow breath, the weight of expectation shifting into something more grounded, something he could actually carry. He stepped forward again, this time reaching for the door, his hand steady, not trembling, not pulling back. The motion simple, but final in a way that changed everything. He paused just before opening it, not from fear, but from understanding that this was no longer about what he would find, but about the fact that he had come at all. Naomi remained beside him, her presence quieter now, almost as if she was stepping back without moving. You do not need me to say anything else, she said softly. William glanced at her for a moment, the connection between them no longer defined by mystery or tension, but by something clearer, something resolved. No, he replied. You already did. Naomi gave a small nod, her expression calm. Then this is yours now, she said. And with that, the space between them shifted, not apart, but forward. William turned back to the door, and this time he did not hesitate. He opened it. The sound of the handle turning soft but distinct as the door moved inward, revealing a space that was both familiar and unknown at the same time. The light inside, dim, but warm enough to show that the past had not vanished, it had simply continued without him. He stepped inside slowly, his eyes adjusting, his breath steady as he crossed the threshold that had once remained closed to him, not by force, but by choice. And in that moment it became clear that the safe had never been the place where everything was kept. It had only been where he chose to stop, because the real truth, the one he had avoided for years, was not locked behind steel. It was waiting here in the place where he finally decided to return. And as William Harrington took another step forward into the life he had once left unfinished, he understood something he had not allowed himself to see before. That showing up did not guarantee an answer, it did not promise forgiveness, it did not erase what had been done, but it changed one thing completely. He was no longer the man who never came back, and that alone was where everything truly began.